Why don't we say the same name for countries when they are a name? I told my name in a foreign country, and it turned out they don't use one of the sounds in it and couldn't pronounce it. Different people changed it to slightly different things to be able to say something close to it. If you introduced yourself as Jane, but the language doesn't have a hard N sound, people might say it as Jenny, or Jane. The language doesn't have the J sound, then people might say Rain, or Tane instead. Countries are probably similar. You frame it like it's outsiders, but Switzerland has different names in French, German, Italian, and Romansh. Montreal has slightly different names in English and French. Different languages are different, they are not just paint by numbers. Even in the context of a person being historic and known around the world, they are known and called by their name because, well, that's their name. No, they are not. For example, Jesus vs Yeshua, Pope Francis va Francesca, pretty much any name in a different alphabet, etc. Good luck with European countries like, or and then would you call Finland Finland or Suomi, and why? A perfect example for this is Hungary, which calls itself Magyarország. There are also cities suffering the same renaming. Milano Italian called Milan English and Mailand German. Then there are the other examples such as Florence equals Fiernes, Naples equals Napoli, and I am sure we could go on and on. You call the Pope Francis, but his name is Francisco. You call his Christopher Columbus, but his assumed actual name was Cristoforo Colombo or Christophorus Columbus. Just some examples. Imagine your name is Heather and you go to France. They are not gonna be able to say Heather. Not even close. You might do better with a new name, but it's probably not gonna happen. Unless everyone there needs to say it to each other for 1,000 years and agree on a spelling, etc. It's often to do with the tribes that lived there long ago. Most countries know the English through the Angles. In Scotland, we use the other half of Anglo-Saxon and refer to them as Sassenach, which is the Gaelic for Saxon. It has the added bonus that they think we are insulting them when we really aren't. This is normal in a lot of languages. In Japanese, the UK is Ijirisu and England is Ingurando. The Japanese got the name of the UK via the Portuguese, and it basically also sounds like England, which as an English person seems a bit harsh to all the Scottish, Welsh and Irish people. England in French is Angleterre. France in Maori is Wiwi. Basically they called it after Wee. Often names of countries come through interactions with other countries or certain tribes. Hence Germany having such diverse names in each language. It's not just a thing in English, it's pretty universal. If we actually did call everyone by their given name, we wouldn't have every single person who has a non-English sounding name give themselves an alternative name to go by because we can't pronounce it. It is strictly for convenience. What an Anglo-centric, extremely monolingual view. Then there are the places that use symbols instead of alphabets, like Japan. The characters for Tokyo literally mean Eastern Capital because back in the day it had to be distinguished from Kyoto, which was the historical capital. While we have anglicized the name of the city, and any Japanese person can recognize the word Tokyo, that is not how it is spelled in Japanese because they don't spell words the way that we do. Hence the question that we expats would get, is that spelled with an R as in London or with an L as in Rome? We do call historic figures differently though. The first person that comes to mind is Christopher Columbus, which in Portuguese he's called Cristo Colombo, and even though it's written kinda similarly, it sounds very different from English. Before modern technology, people learned the names of author places via a long game of telephone. The King of England is called Carol in Poland, and my girlfriend's parents have great difficulty believing that it is actually Charles. They also call Wimbledon, Wimbledon. I get it for Joe Blogs reading the name, but not the news readers. Maybe Pavel Blogs would be better suited :D. Perhaps the way you pronounce the word that is spelled Jane way differently than I would. The phonetics of how we spell things are not identical across languages. Maybe in my language the closest I can think how to spell what you call Jane is something like Janos. Then a few centuries pass and the languages evolve further and the pronunciations morph some more. Perhaps I go back home and tell someone else about this Jane person I met. They've never heard how Jane pronounces their own name, and they have to apply some guesswork on how to pronounce the name I think should be spelled Janos. That's one way. Another is just that I've seen you around and given you a name that I think fits. Then a few centuries later you start to really think about your own identity and decide that you should be called Jane. But me and my buddies are already accustomed to calling you something different. Countries that have more than one native languages have different names. Which one should be used as the right one? Because we often either started giving a country a name before knowing its actual name, or the name is based on the name of a country or something similar that was there prior. Or it's just a different version of the same name, for example change, so it's easier to pronounce for people from that country. Place names go back thousands of years. Why is it considered grace? Exonyms have been a thing for as long as language has been recorded. A country isn't a person. It's actually quite an abstract concept that's only been applied to what we now call sovereign states for a relatively short period of history. Take England, for example. Most countries close enough to England to have had ancient historical dealings with England call England a translated version of Land of the Angles, which, after all, is literally what England means. Which tells us two things. 1. The Angles are distinct enough a cultural group to have a land named after them. 2. They've been in contact with other groups for such a long time that other groups have a name for them in their own language. Angleterra, Anglia, Angeland, Ingilterra, etc., they all mean basically the same thing. I don't care if the French call me Anglais instead of English. They mean exactly the same thing, just different language versions of the same thing.